amount of moments we are, oh wow, it's exciting, isn't it?
Surprise, we are live we
hit the
are
button, and the button works, and we're all here. There are actually 5 of us, and not only 4 of us who are right here in the Zoom together with Rob Wipond, who has blessed us again by joining us for this broadcast. Ryan's pointing upward, but Johanna's in that place on my screen, but my screen's different than the, oh, I see. And we're broadcasting via StreamYard, and we're practicing our broadcast infrastructure. Rob, I am so grateful, and our group members across the network are so grateful that you can join us for these, even considering how much we are essentially winging it.
All right. No, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's ongoing. We never know what's going to happen, and one of the reasons that that we do free flow, we roll with it, like however it needs to go, is that so many people across the entire Intuitive Community Media Network are affected by a pretty long list of really challenging experiences that people can have, different kinds of injuries, different kinds of hardship conditions, different kinds of resource scarcity, all kinds of things that people are dealing with in their families, where people are having really hard times. People are just navigating really big challenges. And what we find is that the more we create safe spaces for dialogue and collaboration that does not require us to be at our best every moment, the more we're able to put real life affirming solutions in place. And it's so needed, considering the whole landscape right now. I wanted to jump right to this research out of Pennsylvania, Rob, that you highlighted in the past, I think, month or two, because it's a really good entry point to what we're talking about today, where there are certain outcomes of the ways that people approach, how do we deal with this really hard situation, or somebody's having a really hard time, and then what's the process that often happens in resourcing that people think, okay, that's available, that will help us out, and then are the outcomes actually positive, or are worse outcomes being achieved? And I would like to talk about that first, and then bring some of our other points in. Do you want to mention some of the elements of that research out of Pennsylvania as we get started?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to try to summarize. And just for anyone else who might be randomly joining us and not know who I am, I'm Rob Wipond. I'm the author of this book, Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. I'm an investigative journalist, and yeah, so my area of expertise is really involuntary commitment and uses of coercion and force in the mental health system. And one thing I can say, based on years of my attempts to find good research into the outcomes of involuntary commitment, I've really found nothing. And there was a trail of, what I found was a trail of researchers who'd gone before me, sort of lamenting and remarking on this fact that, okay, involuntary commitment, forced treatment in psychiatry seems to be a core function of mental health systems, not only in America, but around the world, as wherever there are modern mental health systems in place. And yet, nobody's really even studying if this actually helps people. So we have some studies on what people are experiencing, how they feel about it, and a lot of these are very negative, actually, but almost nothing that just looks at, well, if you claim that by forcibly treating people you're going to achieve X, Y, or Z, do you in fact achieve that? Do these people, what kinds of outcomes are you achieving? Are they feeling better? Are they reporting feeling better? Are they getting housed if they were unhoused? Are they becoming less violent if you said the reason you incarcerated them was because they were potentially going to be violent, and so on and so forth? And we have virtually no studies of this at all, of any kind. So I was excited to see really a groundbreaking study come out of Pennsylvania, out of Allegheny County, I think it's called. It's the county in that
Where I am.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
all right. How do you pronounce it, then?
Allegheny.
Allegheny County. Okay, great. I was pretty close. That holds Pittsburgh. And some researchers there, one of them who actually worked for the county, so I had access to all sorts of data that an ordinary person might not. They did a study looking at what the outcomes were of involuntary commitment across, like a lot of hospitals, several hundred different physicians that were involved in emergency rooms who were deciding whether or not to commit somebody for a certain period of time or to let them go. So the nature of the study is quite complex to describe. It's really interesting, and I encourage people to look at it. They can find it through a PsycForce report, my Substack column. And in any case, the sum of what they really tried to do and seemingly were able to do was kind of look at what they called a sort of judgment call group. So the idea being that if you increase or decrease the number of people who are being locked up in psychiatric hospitals and potentially ultimately treated against their will, what happens to those groups? So because what they were able to do was kind of look at the random assignment of patients to doctors across, I think it was about 14 different hospitals and hundreds of physicians over a 10-year period, something like 15 or 16,000 cases. Wow. And in that, they were able to isolate this sort of policy relevant group, you might say, the group that if we expand involuntary commitment, these are the people who are more likely going to be incarcerated, because in some cases, psychiatrists were deciding, yeah, I'm going to incarcerate this person, and others were deciding, no, I'm not. So in these judgment call cases now, what they found was that within months of their release from this situation, the ones who had actually been incarcerated for some amount of time and involuntarily committed, potentially forcibly treated, these people were more likely to become homeless. They were more likely to commit really serious acts of violence, and they were more likely to kill themselves. So basically, across the board, all the things that they say involuntary commitment is quote unquote good for, actually in the study they found seem to be very bad for. And so this is like a really important study. There's no other study out there to refute it right now. So it's the only one we have. So you obviously, since it's only one study, you can't say that it's ironclad, rock solid universal evidence, but it's really strong and important and interesting evidence. And we don't have anything to contradict it right now. So definitely should be getting a lot more media coverage. It should be talked about publicly a lot more. So that's my quick summary. I don't know if I did a good job there. Feel free to ask any follow-up clarification questions. That was my best attempt to summarize the research that these people did.
I think it's a really great summary. And one of the reasons that data like that is so important, along with all of the really, really good data that you have in your book, is that there are a lot of people who suddenly find themselves in need of real support, and they think that it's going to be there because they've been told that there is some form of support there, and then it turns out that we don't actually have data that holds up to the promises that were made. And that's happening at the same time. There's unfortunately quite a lot of missing information, missing lived experience, missing mistraining, people who are missing really crucial forms of training in their professional environments, where when people encounter things like toxic exposures that cause neuropsychiatric symptoms, people who are just going through really intense times, a whole lot of stress, missing sleep, I think we've talked about in the past, can cause really serious symptoms that are then just thought to be psychiatric. And anything that looks like psychiatric symptoms, it tends to be shuffled into some particular boxes without regard for what's actually been happening in a person's life, whether they've been dealing with violence, whether they have physiological conditions or physiological sensitivities that they haven't been able to get appropriate medical help for, people with neurological injuries of all kinds. Certainly, we've had a lot of discussion in the network about how rampant concussion injuries are that are never recognized or diagnosed or addressed in any way. And of course, anyone with concussion injuries has, I think, a high likelihood of being offered or forced into psychiatric interventions as a result, if they don't have people around them who are really, really listening to them.
Yeah, this is definitely a big part of the problem. One of many problems that I highlight in my book about involuntary commitment. One of them is that it seems to be very common that people coming into emergency rooms with other kinds of conditions are getting labeled with psychiatric illnesses, even if in some cases these would be readily physically diagnosable if the doctors would simply test for them, let alone in cases where it may be a more difficult to detect kind of condition, rare, or something that just doesn't readily present in a kind of with the typical testing that might be done. Then it's really off the hook what starts happening. And I'm not the only one saying this. Like, there have been a number of studies, and in fact a position statement came out from the American Association of Emergency Physicians recognizing this phenomenon as a widespread problem, that there seem to be no real standards by which people attending an emergency room who might be falling into this category of getting labeled with a psychiatric condition were being tested for physical conditions that might be causing their psychiatric issues and problems. And yeah, so it's a widespread issue and concern. People are getting locked up. Sometimes they're getting treated, quote unquote, for psychiatric illness with a psychiatric drug that can in fact make their actual physical problems worse, and often certainly not make them better, but in some cases actually make them worse. And this is appalling and shocking and concerning, and there needs to be much more attention on it. As I said, even though these mainstream organizations recognize the problem, it seems like not a lot of change is occurring. And so every day you can find people coming to psychiatric hospitals and kind of being channeled into being labeled with a mental disorder when they have barely been tested for anything else.
And people are surrounded by the sorts of social cues, policy cues, marketing cues that say when you or your loved one or someone you meet is experiencing these things, here's what should happen next. Here's how to do the responsible thing. And there are a lot of those cues out there. And one of the things that caused us to need to build a media network, a radio network, why Intuitive Public Radio came to exist, is because we noticed that so many people really rely on the sort of larger collective body ambient signaling of, oh gosh, there's a problem, I don't know what to do. I'm part of a community body or a collective body of some kind. Oh, people have solved these problems. I know what to do now, because like, here's this signal and this signal and this signal that says like, this is what's happened. And one of the things going on, and of course, so many of our conversations in the network are about marketing and about how media works, where people would really love to do something that would really help one another. They want to know what to do if they themselves or someone else is really having an extreme experience, especially difficult time. And what happens is that they take action in that way, thinking that there will be a positive outcome, and then they may hear about positive outcomes over those signals. The media is saying, here's this positive outcome. The marketing is saying, here's this positive outcome. And yet so many people go into those systems and they have really negative, really severe outcomes, but then they cannot bring their voices to the foreground, because people tend not to be listening to them anymore. There were a lot of points in your book too that spoke to this, where, you know, people's lives are suddenly ruined because they're put into a box where they're not listened to anymore. They're not taken seriously, when they're the only person who could really help others understand what's actually going on.
Yeah, I mean, you're highlighting a number of different but related issues that are really problematic for sure. You know, I want to highlight one of them, right, which is this cross-cultural signaling we have going on, where people are being encouraged to do this. You know, I'm told, I'm trained, mental health first aid and some of these other training programs that are getting into workplaces and into schools and so on are telling people, this is what you do when, if somebody's in distress, if somebody's upset, you know, you try to talk to them a little bit, but really rapidly the instructions are call 911, you know, get them to a professional, get them into take them to an emergency room at a psychiatric hospital. They kind of create this sense of both fear, like you should be afraid of people who are in emotional distress, and also like this is the best possible thing you can do, you know, is help them in this way. And so people are obeying it, and we see the number of people being taken to or advised to go to or taking themselves to emergency rooms and so on to seek professional psychiatric help of some kind has been going up and up and up. And then we're seeing actually a lot of negative stories. And in fact, that's one of the things that is fairly well studied internationally, is that people report that if they experience coercion in these environments, and they often do, being threatened, intimidated, told you have to take this drug whether you want or not, they really hate it, they loathe it and despise it, and they rarely feel better after that experience. And this is a widespread problem and phenomenon that we've identified. And so, yeah, and then unfortunately, as you highlighted, then the voices of those people are not being forefronted. And just like my book, people would say to me about it, well, you know, how dare you frighten people from going to seek psychiatric help? And I said, it's not me doing that, it's the coercion doing that. I'm simply reporting on the coercion. Anyone who experiences it often says, I never want to seek help again, I never trust any mental health professional again. It's not me doing that, right? I'm trying to highlight this is something we need to talk about culturally and back away from doing so much. But you're absolutely right that these are trends that are going on across our culture, and it's really unfortunate. And we're, rather than being reported more and more, it's being reported less and less relatively to how common it's becoming.
I do want to point people also to the interview that you and I pre-recorded for broadcast in December 2023, because we talked about 911 and 988. We talked about suicide helplines. And some of the unfortunate problems going on there. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the network a lot is, you know, we want to do good research. We want to do good science. And we can't be doing good scientific research if we're omitting a huge part of the data from what we're reviewing, from what we're considering. And that's often what is going on. And I want to say too, there are people who have had really positive, really life-saving experiences in the psychiatric and medical establishments where they've really been relieved to find help that they needed. And it's really important for people to get to evaluate who it might be right for and who it might not be right for. It's really important for people to be able to recognize, oh, for instance, this person had a really positive experience with psychiatric interventions. Oh, because they also had these forms of support at the same time. Whereas somebody without these forms of support would not be able to even survive an encounter with a psychiatric intervention. And that's one of the things that I want to gradually segue into over the course of our conversation here too, is because there are certain kinds of community resourcing, relational resourcing, social fabric. How are we building life-affirming solutions into community environments and community relationships so that people can then choose what is right for them when they need to solve a challenging problem, and have all of the information available about how to do that so that they can pick something that will have a successful outcome and not surprise them by destroying their life instead.
Yes, it's a worthy goal.
I want to hop in there also because, Rob, as I was doing the research now, reading the Substack, the article you have on the front of your Substack today is about a horrible event that happened. I think it was on Fox News, where the host was talking about the forced institutionalization of the homeless, again, or we would say here in the economically or socially isolated population. And that a comment was made that if such a person were to refuse forced institutionalization, they should just be murdered on the spot. They should just be killed. And I think we're talking here about this. Well, if people know and have the choice to make, and if they have people around them, this relational integrity and this social body to help them, that's one thing. But then there's another entirely fundamentally isolated population who it's so difficult for them even to be listened about their basic needs of just survival, if they can be articulate about that. But God forbid they should exhibit some kind of mental health issue. So that's, I think, an interesting bit to say, because what we're talking about, it expands the playing field to folks who are even more fundamentally isolated. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's the pain and the irony. And of course, that was an appalling event. And it was nice to see that it got some serious media attention across the board and critique overall. But, it's just indicative of this really terrible increasing trend in our society, really across the board, right? Of increasing violence and attitude that this is a way to solve problems, is to lock people up and to even use lethal injection, was the phrase the Fox and Friends host used, which was just, unbelievable. But you're right. What you're highlighting here, I think, is very important, is the role of social relationships in the process of involuntary commitment, because it can play out as in two ways. Generally, I would say you're better off with social supports of some kind. Unfortunately, they can sometimes backfire too. If your family is working hard to get you locked up against your will, that really doesn't help. On the other hand, if they're trying to help you, support you, affirm your rights, and just want to assist you in some way in getting the kind of help you would find truly helpful, then supportive family or friends and colleagues and whatnot can be tremendously important. And flip side of that, you're rarely better off totally isolated, because it's just so easy for them to fully take away all your rights and then take advantage of you in that situation. And as far as they're concerned, no one else is looking, right? Because there isn't anyone else. Like, one of the things I say to people that I've learned is that one of the best things you can do as a friend of someone who's being involuntarily committed is simply be there. You don't have to show anything. Just show up and say, oh, I'm their friend. I'm just here to see how they're doing today and say hello. And it just gives a signal to all the staff at that institution somebody else might see whatever we do to this person. Okay, and it just registers in their head. And I think it makes often a significant difference if they think they're operating completely in the dark, which they often are. That they feel like, well, we can do whatever we want, and that just makes things even less likely to go well for the person who's being treated against their will.
I really appreciate you bringing that in, Rob, because that is also a major original function of the Intuitive Community Media Network. We're around, and often we're not able to be in a location with one another. But if someone has contact with people who care about them, it can completely change outcomes. It prevents a lot of different kinds of violence and exploitation, whether that's in or out of the system where exploitation is going on. And we talk a lot in terms of human trafficking, specifically because there are certain elements that make human trafficking that a lot of people don't realize because it's been sensationalized in certain ways. But when there are financial interests making a lot of money off of harming living beings, we're talking about some form of trafficking. We're talking about some form of commoditization of human beings, and we can talk about commoditization of other living beings too, importantly. But when people think, oh wow, this is so big, and like, what could I possibly do? And it's too scary, and it's too complicated, and everybody has had some experience with just like feeling too small and feeling too limited. But one of the things that we try to communicate as much as possible is that just being there with one another in whatever way you can avert a lot of the worst possible things that happen to people who are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I agree totally. And it's vital, I think, to have just even sometimes say don't say anything, because often if you become in too aggressively in defense of someone, you can start getting pathologized as well. And you'll see this in medical records often, that a family member that's defending the right of their family member may end up, oh, this person seems to be suffering a similar delusion to that person, kind of thing. You'll see this in medical records. So it can actually be risky to, and so my general advice is, as you're saying, to actually just be there, be supportive, be polite, be respectful, but just let everyone know there's someone else here for that person who's kind of be coming back and just checking in, and that is going to cares about them. And also it gives a message like, oh, that person has a life. They have a life outside this institution. And that's a nice reminder to the practitioners that of, your quote unquote normalcy. I don't like to use that term, but just the fact that you have connections, you have friends, you have a life, you might have a job, you might, these things that are signals in those kind of situations that, oh, well, maybe this person isn't as quote unquote crazy as we're labeling them as. Maybe it's episodic, maybe we're biased, right? These kinds of questions can enter in a little more easily if they're kind of seeing that, oh, there's some reasonably ordinary person here who's got a friendship with that person.
I'm wanting to bring up some of the work that I've been fortunate to do with Johanna Otigam and Kim Berra over the past, was something like, it's multiple years. How many years? Was just like this many possible years. So Rob, what year was it that you were writing your book and I first ended up connected with you? What year do you think that might have been? Like,
I think around 2019 or 20.
Okay.
Even earlier, perhaps. Yeah, maybe 2018, somewhere. Probably 19. Yeah, I in there, right around there.
So at that time, I was going through some especially hardcore intersections, and it took another year or two for Johanna and Kim to end up in the Intuitive Network. And one of the things that I want to bring in, and I want to ask, I want to ask Johanna her thoughts about, and I want to ask Kim her thoughts about. One of the things that happened is that both Johanna and Kim, in different times, showed up for me when no one else could hear what I was saying at all. So like the power of being able to listen to someone that no one else is listening to is a really intensive power. It's a really powerful thing. And Johanna, I'll ask you, since you're on screen first, and when Kim might want to chime in later, I would love that. The experiences that we've had getting through that really, really hard stuff, where other people will look at me and they would think, this person's not going to get through that. This person is like people start thinking of you as if you're dead already. And I've had a lot of those experiences. And a big part of the reason that I'm here, that I can do this right now for all that is going on, is because somehow we have found another person and another person who just recognized the value of being there and listening to what a person is saying and seeking to learn from what a person is saying. And Johanna, you have such skill in that. And so often, like you haven't been able to be on camera with us, even when I've been able to be on camera, which has not been as often recently. But I would love if you would share some of your experiences of that, listening to people who are not being listened to, because it's a key thing.
I would love to. One of the ways I talk about my experiences with the network is I actually frame it as an apprenticeship, because it's not like I didn't already have a setup to be interested and exceptional in certain ways as far as how I can tune into what's happening for survivors. But the Intuitive Network and working with you, Megan, Elizabeth, and all the other people I've been able to be in contact with, it really sort of helped me cross a threshold with having a lens on what if every single person that we're othering or we're saying they're this or so on, right? That they have a story, that they're a human being. So I feel like, sometimes we've talked about like professional citizenship or professional friendship, or I don't know really what words to use. I'm a little stumbly because I'm not on camera very often. But as you and Rob have been talking, I'm just thinking about kind of an adjacent to the network conversation. It's part of the network, but sort of a subset around care gaps and care gap leadership. And that's been a huge focus. It's something that I've really been doing a lot of development on. I've done a lot of live social experimenting in real time in people's lives. And I don't mean that in like a mercenary way of like I'm randomly experimenting, but I'm really like creatively attempting to meet people where they're at, because I recognize, the network is full of people, and there's so many people in my life that have had a track of things not being addressed that compound and get bigger and get worse, and there start to be cascades. So I recognize, like, I'm sort of starting from a place of like assuming somebody experiencing severity has had that happen. They've had so many times people didn't listen to them. So it's twofold, because I love what you guys are talking about, the difference that just one person can make. But when we think in terms of care gap leadership about, it'd be nice if we didn't have to like correct harms or fend off harmful stuff, because it's complicated enough to solve problems without monetary interests and other things kind of making it harder, right? Or just, I don't know, different things like that are sort of working against us. But so I've had different levels of success as an individual supporting other individuals. And I've had a lot of times where I was willing and wanting to step in and do more, and I hit a limit of but so my point is that we know so much. Survivors, disability justice world, have done so much work on like, what can we do and what's needed and what should we do instead? And so, bridging those gaps, I'm so glad we're having a public conversation about this today, because it's very, very possible to help people. But, you know, people who are in there, like working with people experiencing homelessness and stuff, like there is an awareness that things have compounded and they're complicated to get someone stable again. So there is some awareness of that, I think. But so like I had an experience once where I was working with a survivor with communication differences and sort of extreme expressions and stuff. And she had a few friends in her life that were really struggling with trying to figure out how to support her. And they didn't want to leave the relationship, but they kept getting overwhelmed. And like, so I've played that role too, of just doing like a little bit of coaching to help someone manage. Like, you know, there's people, helpers who might be the only helper trying to help someone with a really complicated situation. So, you know, sometimes I've been able to just help people like stay in the game and take care of themselves better as they're helping people. So that's just like a little tiny window on what's happening underground that nobody sees, that there's people trying to help. They might be peers who are struggling, and that's why they recognize the complex, compounded situation, and so on. So, you know, we're specifically talking, you know, referencing Rob's work around the carceral systems. But there's many people in other layers of, you know, contact with psychiatry, or not getting their health needs met. I mean, I've worked with another young person with communications differences, and I have watched him attempt every single day to make connections and get help. And he needs someone who can bridge, like, be there with him, understand his communication style. Like I can see through, because I have experience of like the level of success that's possible when we have the resources. It's very frustrating to me to be like remote from a person, and like, how do I find someone that this kid would feel safe with that can help him go to all these appointments and get the resources that he needs, you know? So,
and that's so often, that's exactly it, is that someone is isolated from people. Someone is socially isolated. And how do they rebuild those connections after they've been beset with all these labels that tell people to be afraid of them or to stay away from them? And that's so serious.
Or to just dismiss what they're saying.
Right.
It just happens so quick. People don't even think, and they're like, oh, you just said that thing, it means this, and they're not really listening. We know the value of deep listening. You know, we've saved each other's lives in various ways a lot of times because
with deep listening.
Yeah, with deep listening, we're not there to say, I know what the thing is. I'm here to listen and find out how to best support you. And it's very doable, and we need some patience and, you know, to be moving a little slower.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to mention too, like Rob, you're highlighting very specific forms of incarceration. And then you're referring to, in a lot of ways, all of these other forms of incarceration that people don't think of as incarceration, where people can't solve problems in their lives because of how traumatic and how violent something has been in an experience with a system. You know, people who are already homeless, they often stay homeless. People who were not homeless in the first place often become homeless. It gets really difficult for people to sort things out. And it becomes another form of imprisonment, that social isolation that results from that. So there are these different levels of incarceration occurring, and I wonder if you might want to comment on that, but before I call Kim in and see if Kim wants to share some insights.
I'm not sure exactly what you are asking relative to commenting on. I mean, I appreciated all the stuff Joanna was saying, and I affirm it totally that there's a very vital, important role. And in fact, I even think that I think it might be especially problematic for families to do it for each other. I think there's a vital role for friends here, people who don't have that history, like obviously it's great if you can get along with your family. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm saying in these kinds of crises, it often seems that the family is sort of implicated in a way, whether they rightly or wrongly, or whatever, right? In the person's mind, often they don't have a pure, connect, objective, neutral relationship with their family. And sometimes that's been forced upon them in a really bad way. And other times it is just like, because that shared history, they feel tangled up. And so all the feedback they get through that route is really not actually as freeing in some ways as it can be to just have your own friends who you have built into friendships over time with, and a shared, and there's mutual respect there, and lots of other things can kind of come into play. I think, I'm guessing, but Joanne, I feel like you'd probably, agree with me that I don't think it's only listening. I think there's something more you're giving there. True attention, true, attempt to understand, maybe even feedback that's genuine, right? Like, well, what you're saying to me right now isn't actually making a lot of sense, but the other part did. And do you want to try clarifying, or whatever it might be, something like this is genuine and honest, and where you're at with that person at that time. And I think that can be invaluable, and it's very hard actually to reproduce in a professional environment or in a family environment. And so I guess that's one of the things I just affirm, is that the non-expert friendship plays a vital role in all this, and I think that we should be upholding it more in our society, and then the relationships that come with that. If you do have colleagues or other people in your life who are just more understanding than they might otherwise be, do not go by default to fear, to anxiety, calling professionals, but simply go into a natural sort of dynamic with you, organically interact with you when you're really struggling in a difficult state. It can be really helpful too. So I don't want to underplay that. And unfortunately, in our culture, it's being put down a lot by this sort of professional training that people are being put through.
I think I definitely agree with that. And I think part of the other layer, besides like just being a good listener, is that I have really educated myself to prioritize the voices of the affected person. And so it's kind of an advocacy energy. And like I said on the broadcast last time via text, like if we listen deeply, people know what they need. I don't know. I can't predict how long it's going to take for it to emerge, but they probably already told you, pretty quickly what they need, and you might not, so, and I guess I just want to say that it's not the language I might use if I had kind of more time to consider it, but because people's neurological injuries and communication differences and certain kinds of disabilities, especially invisible ones, are so misunderstood, and there's all this texture of like fear of the mad person or the sufferer. Is sickness contagious? I've really done a lot of work to counteract that and come with a different lens and try to encourage other people to prioritize people's own knowledge of themselves and help emerge it as well. And because it's really, I don't want to say it this way, but it's really easy to abuse disabled people because we're already like dismissed, or like we already are often othered. It's like if people haven't done the work to dismantle ableism, as it might be in a common leftist parlance or something, you don't know yet you might be conditioned to be dismissive or to think, like the basic thing that happens with the power dynamic with providers is, oh, you're suffering. You obviously don't know how to fix this problem. I know what to do, and I'm going to come in and say. So that's part of what's happening in families. It might just be families. It might not be families. It could be anybody that said, oh, you're a vulnerable person. Let me take you in. And there starts to be a power imbalance and so on. So that's really where I've focused my work, is let's do the opposite of that. And I'm in the crucible of it all the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm happy to try and chime in, but everything that everyone has said so far is so eloquent and so important and so gets to the heart of it that I'm not really sure what I can add except to say, to kind of echo some of what's been said, especially, I mean, Johanna, your comments were just so on point in terms of what people are going through, and that generally people do know what they need. And it takes those of us who maybe are less severely affected or don't even know that we're affected by all the ambient toxicity and trauma and the dominant paradigm, which itself is toxic. It takes us to be able to do that self-education and unlearn some of the nonsense that we've been taught and center the person who is most affected. And that can be difficult because the system is really not set up to help them. The system is an illusion. And the more I've been working with the Intuitive Network over the past 4 years, as well as other, educational communities that are trying to challenge the dominant system, the more I've realized, kind of what a scam it all is, what we're doing here. Again, working in healthcare as I do, it's like every day clients are telling me what they need. And then honestly, part of the challenge for me is that I'm left with the distress of knowing I can't immediately provide that for them. Anybody that says they can is lying. So, I mean, just basic necessities like housing, like safe places to sleep at night, or, safe ways to take on whatever symptoms they're having, whether it be mental health distress or drug use or whatever that they are doing for reasons, right? That they are having these symptoms and these behaviors for reasons. And to be able to take the time to process with them what might actually be helpful, and to do that deep listening, that we're talking about, where obviously whatever they're currently doing is serving some purpose for them, although there should be way more options of better ways to serve that purpose. And very often it is, those behaviors and those situations are responses to deep emotional distress, to terrible trauma histories, to not being heard or respected or listened to. And, Rob, just to go back to what you were saying about it's more than listening, I think that the kind of deep listening that Joha is describing, and I think we all know this, but I just want to explicitly state it, it includes listening with deep respect and belief in that person's capacity to be their own advocate, to say what they need, and to try to help them figure out how we can get it listened to, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think that's enough for now. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Kim.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely.
So it seems like this is a really excellent opportunity to spend our remaining time talking about solutions. So many places we find these conversations, there's so much that we all have to say about what's going wrong. Often it's really difficult for people to spend time on what do we do instead. And a lot of the time it seems like people don't even know how to start having those conversations, or if they start, then they kind of trail off into despair a lot of the time. And so we're working really diligently in the network to uplift, let's spend time, let's put our hearts into some really life-affirming solutions, and let's give that as much of our energy as possible, because we see things shift in such beautiful ways when we do that. And Rob, what I would really like to start with is to ask you what kinds of, you've talked about community building in the past that we've wanted to spend more time talking about. What kinds of solutions, what kinds of platforms, what kinds of resources do you feel are especially powerful for people to really spend their time focusing on, so we're not just fighting the fight all the time?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to delve into that and answer it. One of the things I do in the book, I'll just highlight for people, is that I look at that there are quite a few fairly well-studied, piloted, tested, and successful approaches, particularly to crisis intervention, providing longer term stability for people in non-hierarchical kind of housing environments and supportive. There's actually a lot of stuff that's been tried and tested and proven successful out there, but the dominant system of mental health intervention for involuntary commitment is medicalized, and so they actually resist this stuff. The doctors are not trained in it, and usually they don't like it because it comes from a different background. It may be led by social workers, maybe led by psychologists, maybe led by peers. And something that therefore they see as professionally threatening. They also dismiss it because it's not biologically oriented. That's their training and their view of all this stuff. And so what we have right now is a real problem where a lot of things that should be getting funding and could really be helping in this environment are actually being repressed, suppressed, and not funded because of the role of the medicalized thinking and the medical profession and all this, and the fact that politicians predominantly listen to that sort of medicalized view, and the legislation itself is framed around it. So mental health laws typically make the medical doctor, the physician, the psychiatrist, the top dog, the most powerful person under the legislation, ultimately arbitrating all of the decisions. And so that pollutes the entire environment we're talking about here. So that's important for people to understand. That's why we don't have really robust alternatives out there. And then it really depends what group or subgroup or types of problems you want to kind of pick to say what would be an alternative approach there. The most obvious one being homelessness. And it's amazing how far housing and guaranteed livable income can go. And then if you add a little bit of practical daily support to that, it's incredible how many people you can house successfully. And we've tested this again and again, find 80 to 90% right off the bat will get long-term stable housing in that kind of environment. And then we're just talking about a slightly more extreme or difficult or challenging 5 or 10% out of this group, and say, okay, what do they need? Maybe that's a little different here. We can approach that. But then the vast majority of people being involuntarily committed aren't even homeless people anyway to begin with. So we could start talking about those groups, But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is what we've been talking about now, is a more community-based approach to just the whole spectrum of issues that ultimately may lead to some subgroups within their subpopulations ultimately turning to the mental health system for support. But did they need that? Were there ways that we could have intervened together earlier on that would have helped that person? And so I'm really interested in these approaches that say, hey, everyone in a community has something to offer everyone else. How can we rebuild our communities? Because they are very fragmented in North America in particular right now. It's a really common feature of westernized societies that people are just not really connected with the neighbors in their buildings, with the neighbors on their streets. And so that, fear starts coming up for me, and I literally walk out my door, I'm more likely to experience fear than to experience hey, how's it going? Hey, what are you up to? You want to hang out? You know what I mean? Like the things that in a more culturally connected society I might have experienced either today elsewhere in the world or historically in our own Western culture. So that's something that I'm trying to work with other people to sort of look at approaches to sort of breaking that down and saying, how can people relearn how to provide a whole slew of different types of supports to each other.
One of the things that I was just going to ask you, Ryan, to chime in on something, but maybe I should let you chime in on what you're already thinking about chiming in instead of doing that.
Well, no, I mean this is a softball down the center of the Peter Block work, right? The community
exactly
work.
What I was about to bring in. Yeah,
that is connecting people to each other as human beings in small groups without this idea that, oh, you're coming in here, you're staking this about how you are in the moment. Oh, and I'm going to immediately say, oh, I did this. I'm going to help you, right? No. These dialogic frames, specifically the 6 conversations with Peter Block, it's about connecting as human beings in small groups where we are being with each other around very, very basic, a progressively challenging series of questions if you have enough space to do it. I mean, it just starts, why was it important for you to be here today? And to go into a group of 3 people and to just be with each other's, why is that important to you? What does that mean to you? And not because I want to diagnose you and I'm looking and oh, I want to pay attention to you so that I can go back into when we get into a large group and say, oh, this is what happened with the group. I'm going to report out to that. What happens in these environments, again, when we get people together, we gather them differently, invitationally to a large group where we get them immediately as soon as possible into this connecting group where we were just listening to each other as we talk. And then when you come out, it's not like, oh, group 1, what did you have to say? What did the 3 people in your group have to say? And when it's about what struck you about the conversation you were in. And a few people share that, and then you go to the next level of a question around what's the possibility, right? What could we do together in our community that none of us could do alone? And then you go back into small groups, have that conversation for 8 to 12 minutes, give it a little space, and then come back. What struck you about that? And just the sheer act of being with someone else, and very importantly, choosing a stranger. Who is in these small groups, you choose who you're with. Choose someone who you've never been with before. Choose a stranger that you get to know them over this period of time. And again, the whole point of this work is that why would I want to say hello to you in my apartment complex? Why would I want to wave to you along the street, or God forbid, to do something with you, a project, if I don't know you, if I don't care about you, if I don't know what's important to you, and just show you a respect for your human dignity, and absent whatever I think needs to change about you in order to make our community better. It's a total flip in this creation of community through the basis of relational integrity, Megan Elizabeth. That's what we're talking about. How do we bond together as people so that, oh my gosh, in this community, there's that we gather for the reason that there is a problem with forced incarceration for people who have expressed invisible disabilities, and to connect around that topic. So the book community, again, is, as you may be aware, that Peter Block's book, it goes into all those questions and it poses that possibility. It's about engaging with people, not from the standpoint of their problems, not from your deficiencies, that you are a possibility, that you have, and again, Rob, you've spoken to it beautifully. You are a gift, and you are a possibility, and you're not a problem. So that work is important. I think the dialogic processes that connect us as human beings, and as there are many, I think, as I hear the conversation, it's extremely important to have that human connection of listening. I hear you and I see you, and I want you to feel listened to and seen. So.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, and Peter Block and those kinds of processes you're talking about. Peter's widely known and respected part of the sort of background that I'm coming from as well, called asset-based community development, co-founded by John McKnight. And there's no end of people that have developed and adapted and changed that, and that's exactly what the founders of that 100 years ago would have wanted to see occur as well, that for a multiplicity of approaches to take. And so I work with a couple of groups where I am that do that kind of work as well. We're looking at different ways of bringing people together who are neighbors. Essentially, that's the area we focus on, and asking them, what would you like to do together. And we often are bringing forth ideas and suggestions to give them a vision of what's possible, and then just trying to kind of stir those dialogues. But it's really a Trojan horse in a way, just to kind of create the connections that Ryan was just talking about, get people in a room where they're sharing and they're getting to know each other, and they're learning about their common interests and common ground, and so on and so forth. And that itself is an amazing fabric that it starts to get interwoven. And even if you do nothing else, you find that, guess what? Well, a week later, if the two of you pass on the street, you're like, hey, good to see you again, right? So you've kind of knitted something together, even with that simple little one-time meeting, let alone if you provide some loose structure for those people to meet together over a regular basis, and maybe help facilitate like a project that they come up with where they say, we'd really like to do this together. And if we can provide some sort of resources or facilitation support to help them do that, then they're together for a longer period and they have this success. So one of the things we work on, for example, is emergency preparedness. We find that there's a lot of people in neighborhoods and in buildings who are like, yeah, I'd kind of like to know more myself about to be ready for a fire or an earthquake, or even just a daily crisis of some kind because I have this or that disability. And so, yeah, just having someone that I can connect with during a heat wave or something who might check in on me, make sure, that I'm okay. That would be great. Things like this, people start sharing this stuff, and then they want to collaborate on something together. And we've also find when we do that emotional stuff comes up as part of that, where they're saying, yeah, like, I would really like someone that I can turn to when I'm going through emotional struggles of different kinds. And so the group will start talking about that, and they might share some of their anxieties and concerns with that, about boundaries and safety, and okay, maybe someone else's need is more than I'm able to offer, and what then? But at least it's kind of coming out and people are talking about it and sharing it. And often what we'll find is it's the spontaneous networking that's the most important. You can't just force a random group of 10 people to suddenly say, yes, I'll be there for you no matter what, right? But it's more like, oh, there'll be those 1 or 2 people, 3 people in the group who'll say, hey, let's get together again. And they'll start to build a real relationship over time. And it's that spontaneous stuff that we hear about that is often the most important that emerges from this. And so it's really just a matter of creating the circumstances that allow people to come together and then create their own relationships out of it.
It's all about invitation and agency for sure. Joha, bring it on.
Yeah. So one of the phrases I've adopted that I use a lot is creating the conditions. And I also just want to point out that you're talking about kind of an intuitive movement or something more intuitive too. So I just am loving that intersection. So I'm just kind of excited to share. I'm working with a trauma integration professional, and one of the things that they have brought me just been like such a good nugget is like we actually slow down to get more done, or we have a more incremental process or a slow process of getting to know each other, and we actually get more done, right? So we talk about cutting things up into smaller pieces, and also like turning the heat down on the problem so that we can actually function better emotionally and nervous system wise, right? So that's a safe space kind of thing. So yeah, I wanted to bring that in. And there was another piece that I might remember. And then when there's a good moment, it could be now. I want to just invite a little vision about what's possible. I'll just say it now. So all these dollars, all this energy, all the inertia of how the mental health care and other healthcare and benefit systems for people in need, tattered social fabric that we know can be rebuilt, right? People can connect. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was we've talked a lot in the network too about bridging, sort of as a key idea, and it can be slow, and it's, it could be one person at a time, but public broadcasting can reach more people. How are we pollinating? How are we reaching? People don't know about these ideas. They don't know that there's been some pilot projects in Africa where elders are supported to do something they would naturally do and kind of integrate with the healthcare system. And they sit on a park bench and their community and see if anybody needs anything. And that's a supported role. So as far as inviting vision, like there's also, I'm not sure what it's called, but there's like a indigenous interconnectedness model that people are developing as well too, that I think, you know, other cultures could learn from and really benefit from, because it's a more, I just keep kind of wanting to make this gesture of like making things lateral. So people like me, Megan, Elizabeth, maybe you guys too, right? Like we're showing up in community and doing what we can. But what if all those dollars and that inertia that we're doing things that we don't want them to do? I just want to like invite a little bit of vision of like, what if all that resourcing, you know, went to people, you know, in a more lateral fashion, so that people in the community have a little bit more access to resources to help people, because they're already showing up and doing it, right? But if they're isolated, or like I'm protecting other people from the intensity of the work that I'm doing rather than asking them for support, all kinds of things like that. So I don't know, there's probably more fun vision things I could add at a later point, but kind of lateralizing and just like, what if that shift happened? I mean, I think just it seems like there's so many resources that could be used differently that already exist. Like during the Occupy movement, I came across toward the end of its heyday, this idea called Occupy the Hearth. And it was like, we've got all these buildings and some of them aren't being used. And what if we, you know, started to use them for community spaces, or just ideas like that, right? So
yeah, thanks, Joanne. I just want to jump in on that 'cause it's exciting. Exactly. And that's one of the foundational critiques and proposals of asset-based community development, is to say, we got to stop telling people what they need and then giving it to them and spending god-awful amounts of money on that, but rather going into communities saying, what do you need? And just provide enough to facilitate that discussion process, and then provide funds for that. You know, there's a great example that John McKnight uses in his book, Community and Its Counterfeits, is that they went into one community like that, and they found that the emergency room, the local emergency room of the hospital, was using up an enormous amount of resources, just all sorts of you know, people coming in there with accidents and problems and issues. And so they studied it and found that a big issue was people right nearby getting hit by cars on the street, and the community said, hey, can we do a traffic calming experiment? So they went out there, did a traffic calming experiment, and yeah, the number of people showing up at the local hospital with traffic injuries dropped dramatically. And so the proposal then would be, well, then we take some of that money that's going to the hospital and redirect it to the community to try other types of experiments of that kind? And that's the sort of thinking we need, right? The way John McKnight proposes it now is just simply that if you are going to have government services of different kinds, or public services, those people should be paid simply to facilitate, to help communities access what they want to do and what they want, and then help connect them to the funding. That's the role they should be playing, but not the model we have now, which is government bureaucrats in all their expertise figure out what they think you need, and then all huge amounts of money is spent giving it to you whether you want it or not. And involuntary commitment is like the ultimate example of that. It's eating up tens of billions of dollars a year, and you'd have to say, gee, you know, if the relative hundreds of millions in my community, if I could redirect that, do I think I might be able to figure out, in collaboration with those people who are being committed, you know, what might work better for them than a few weeks in a psychiatric hospital once a year? You know, it's god awful expensive.
That's my favorite set of points. Rob, looking at the data that you've been compiling from your book forward, from your book through your Substack, through YouTube, all of which can be found at, oh wait, where's that again? There it is, robwipond.com. I got it. The huge amounts of activity that is being funded, that is causing problems, that is causing violence and homelessness, that doesn't have any, there's no evidence that it has better outcomes necessarily in so many cases. And there are people, individual people and groups of people who are so committed to doing life-honoring, life-affirming things that they're doing it even though they're essentially being killed while they're trying to do it. They're doing it even without resources. They're doing it while economically excluded. They're doing it while being preyed upon by violent perpetrators. They're doing really amazing, they're implementing really amazing human solutions. And wow, what would happen if we were funding those solutions instead of the systems perpetuating more violence?
Yeah.
Joel. Yeah,
Well,
that's where I'm at too.
Yeah, yeah, the amounts of money, you know, I think that one of the numbers I got for the mental health system is like $180 billion annually in the United States alone for the mental health system. Now, that's not only involuntary commitment, but still, like, you do really start to wonder, because really across the mental health system as a whole, there's very little outcome tracking or outcome studies to show that this is really benefiting people. And in a lot of cases, of course, you know, people are voluntarily seeking out mental health support, but you do wonder, well, if you really sat down, and I've had a great example of this, like a group I knew that ran a clinic in a major city did a process of this kind where they went out to the community and said, hey, like, they ran the clinic, you know, a little hospital clinic, and said, but what are your real day-to-day problems? What would really benefit you? And the predominant thing that kept coming to the surface in these focus groups was mental health. We need mental health support, mental health support. And they found this very perplexing, and they query further. And then they'd find out that mental health was just like the only thing people thought they could get, right? That really it was, well, you started with, well, mental health support because I'm depressed. Well, what are you depressed about? Well, and then they'd elaborate on their lives. It's like, you know, I've got these problems at home, and I am trying to get a job on my own, and I don't have enough money to get on the bus. And that's the real problem. If only I had enough money to go to get transport back and forth every day, I'd be able to accept this job that was offered to me. But now I can't because I'm broke, or, you know, whatever. These sort of cycles of problems that people were caught in that often had nothing to do with their mental health, but they didn't believe that there were ready-made solutions for. And so that, I think that's a real important indication of a rethinking that needs to occur in our society. And the mental health system is just one. The enormous amounts of money going into social work. And I'm not saying that, oh, well, let's get rid of them entirely. I think obviously they can play an important supportive role. But I think right now those systems have become far too powerful, far too expensive, and that we need to relook at how can we funnel some of that money into different sorts of avenues. And peer support of different kinds, what you're talking about, is one of the biggies, because we have actually a really strong evidence base to support the effectiveness of, say, for example, a peer-run little alternative to a hospital environment, just a comfortable home that's staffed by peers who've been through emergency psychiatric difficulties of different kinds, and they're there and they're just providing support to you. You have this alternative to show up and hang out there for a couple of weeks instead of going to the hospital. It's far cheaper. It's incredibly effective for a vast swath of people, and they should be much more robustly supported, and they're not. So, but that's a great example of, and there's so many models like that. And if we started putting real money and research into it more robustly, what else would we find that these kinds of networks of support can achieve and do? We don't know, and it would be great to find out. And as you're describing, a lot of it right now is just being done entirely volunteer by people who really have almost no time to volunteer, because they're dealing with their own issues, and they've got multiple problems, and they aren't earning like huge amounts of money themselves, and all these things are sort of going on, and yet they're the ones that are kind of also doing some of this really important work. And it'd be great to reorient that right now. But the powers that be and the lobbying voices that are being heard by the politicians, they got a totally different agenda out there, and there is a lot of money to be made off of exploiting people, in the vulnerable people. And that's really the dominant voice right now, is people who are professional private equity corporations and so on, that are running group homes, and they got the ear politicians say, no, let us manage these people, and let us charge the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, or let us charge some other entity for taking care of these people. And we don't really have great evidence that they do a great job at it. In fact, we've got burgeoning evidence that it's backfiring in all these ways.
Well, it's not good for them. They're not good outcomes for those people who are institutionalized. This is a great outcome for the person who has these people out of their mind and out of their head. They're just away from my discomfort, right?
Yeah, and
So,
for the profiteers, yes, it's great for them.
Well,
yeah.
and we can say it may feel like a great outcome temporarily, but people who are feeling that relief that they don't have to handle that situation lose the opportunity to rise to a challenge in a way that makes them stronger and more skilled and more capable, with stronger relationships and a stronger capacity to respond to difficult situations. And without that, the body deteriorates. People deteriorate because they don't rise to challenges, and they don't build that kind of muscle. And I certainly want to say too that, like, it's so good where people are doing this work where they're barely getting paid. People are doing this work where it's very difficult for them to do the work, and they're managing to do it professionally in a variety of ways. And we also really highlight where people are doing this work on the front lines of economic exclusion, where there's no money to be made at all. They cannot get any kind of income. They're dealing with the most violent, most invisible, most compounded circumstances. And no one knows that they're there. People will maybe see that situation, and they will immediately pathologize it and say, well, they're doing something wrong, or they have mental illness, or we gotta kind of stay away from that. Where actually people with the most highly developed skill sets in responding to extremity are lost from the rest of the community body, and the community body really needs them. So that what we talk about a lot, The Abundant Community, is the book that Ryan held up earlier, that is by Peter Block and John McKnight. We also talk about Tim Vogt a lot, and I often rattle off the three of their names in succession, and then sometimes I mix their names around. John McKnight and Peter Block wrote that book, The Abundant Community. And one of the great things in that book is where it says, there's this thing where everybody's outsourcing what should be their natural relationships with their family and community members to experts outside of the community. So all this resourcing is flowing away from the community to these experts who aren't in relationship, and often, generally, are not allowed to be in relationship directly with community members. And what do we lose when we're not in relationship with one another? And it strikes me a lot of the time, when we talk about this whole landscape, we have just all of the different, I think about all of the languaging that you have to use, Rob, in order to make the points that you make, in order to share the data that you share. There's this language of what has been systematized in this particular way. And then there's a stark contrast between that and what is our language of caring for one another and being creative with one another and making friends and building long-term relationships and sharing our lives and sharing meals and sharing music and dancing together. Doing what do community members do? How do people have relationships is something that's slipping away when we fail to center it.
Yeah. And that's so profound in so many ways. Like even when people participate in some of those things in their communities now, it's in a large city, and so they're all journeying to be together for a time. And one of the things we've lost is local community, and that has a unique way of providing support for people that's missing as well. And yeah, it's really, it's sad and it's shocking, and I do really, it's amazing when you look back now at how these thinkers were very prophetic. A lot of what they were writing originally around the notion of the professionalization of ordinary types of supports like these really goes back now 50, 60, 70, 80 years, that they were saying this is bad and getting worse. And it really has only gotten worse now, where an average person with a quote unquote who's been labeled with a serious mental illness is maybe chronically in the system, they'll have no friends, because the only people in their lives they'll be encircled by professionals or wraparound programs of different kinds, ultimately that are not even helping make that person better. They're just like managers now, saying we're going to maybe prevent this person from ending up completely on the street again, or not, right? And that's about the best they're doing in a lot of these cases, with an enormous amount of money going into that one person, that the one person or the few connections they might still have in their lives are not able to access directly. They can only get it through these sort of programs that they barely find helpful or don't even want. That's a picture I'm drawing there that is more the rule now than the exception, where a person has increasingly isolated in a quote unquote mental health problem, rather than being helped to kind of reconnect and re-knit the fabric of their community with themselves.
I've experienced that. I've been, doing what I can to bust out of it. Yeah, so I want to bring in another layer that could be more lateral. So I want to invite Kim to speak on this too. So for care professionals, so my mom's a medical professional and she's worked on anti-homelessness projects and stuff too. And when I would talk to her about I would bring in some of the sort of justice language, like gatekeeping and da-da-da, and she'd be like, she had actually done her own study on it, and she said, no, let's talk about enclosures and the restrictions and the social and economic support that's keeping all these providers and professionals, in alignment and not, they're given a lot of support for following along with the protocol, and there's a lot of risk for them to do something else. So I went to a meeting with Kim, also participates in the Institute for Development of Human Arts, IDHA. So they have membership meetings sometimes, and there's a lot of peer social workers and other professionals in that organization. So one of the things that someone talked about was that social workers actually drove the disability rights movement and were like on the streets with their clients, like kind of up until the 90s. And then there was a crackdown and a shift that I'm not sure anyone even realizes, right? So there used to be a little bit different. But anyway, my point is, just to invite the question of like, how can we support and invite and create slightly less levels of risk or alternatives for people who, almost nobody enters mental health professions without wanting to actually serve and help people, right? So they may get caught in things and so on. But I know Kim's really worked on this in her own work. And yeah, just imagining that how can we. Okay, so I also just want to point out that there's so many people, including like lots of people that I've worked with who've been on my care teams, who are working from within the system to make changes in a slow way, and that's happening. So what if we were to bridge and we weren't, and like people weren't so disconnected from each other, and they could talk through a strategy or develop a way around the risks of doing something different, or just had more advocacy skills. Like a lot of the people that I work with, you know, they're constantly changing staff on me. So I'm getting somebody who's fresh out of college with a social work degree, who's working on their clinical hours. They're getting really minimal training. They've never heard of IDHA or, you know, so, and another point I want to make about this is things like peer respite and peer support, or organizations like IDHA, they actually get a ton of pressure because they're so rare, and it makes people feel so hopeful that there's an alternative. So I want to both, like, I want to have a vision for empowering people who are care professionals, but then also people who are, you know, peers or have been marginalized, to, you know, to study, to work together, to create resources, rather than thinking, oh, this parent organization will save me because they're a peer run one. And they, you know, all the peer organizations are so strapped. They're doing amazing work. Like, I'm so proud of what Wildflower's doing and all these other really great peer-based organizations, but there's only a few of them, and none of them have the resources they need. So both the care professionals and the rise of peer energy and empowerment, I think, are really important things to emphasize in this too. And Kim, do you want to share on that?
Thanks, Joha. I would love to jump in now if that's okay with people, and just say that, you know, again, I
muted myself, unfortunately. That's what...
Kim, you're muted.
Whoops.
Oh,
You got
there
muted.
you are. There you are.
Kim,
Sorry.
can you say again? Can you start again?
Sure. Sorry about that. I don't know. I might have done that myself, actually. Just to kind of echo what Joha was saying, yes, the care professionals, so-called, and the people who are supposedly the recipients of care really need to all be on the same team. And that's one of the things that I've really loved about the Intuitive Network. It's like not a us and them. It's not a, you know, which side are you on? It's like we're all in this together, and there are so many different layers to it, right? That obviously money needs to be distributed way differently than it has been, and power also needs to be, you know, thought about in a way different way. And sometimes it can be easy to feel like, well, geez, we're light years away from that. But also, as has been said, you know, people are already doing amazing things with the barest of resources, with the harshest of conditions already. So it's kind of like, in terms of going back to what Megan Elizabeth raised at sort of the top of this segment, of like, how do we focus on solutions where people can feel hopeful and not just always demoralized and discouraged? Is like, well, sort of figure out where we can fit in and do, each of us is doing our part, right? I'm feeling like so many people, I would say probably the majority of people now, right? If we're going to go with like the 1% and the 99%, most people now are somewhat dissatisfied with the status quo, with the way that things are running. And then we might have lots and lots of different opinions of how it should be changed, but most everybody agrees it needs to change, right? So, you know, some of us will do more direct advocacy and lobbying and, you know, working on the funding streams and stuff like that. And other people will be sort of fighting it from within the system, like I'm trying to do. And then building those bridges, like the bridge building is so essential to be able to let people know, you know, let each other know basically, well, what's keeping you going, even though these are the conditions that we find ourselves in? What's been a source of, you know, hope and inspiration and vitality for you? And then like really just sharing those ideas and sharing what each of us is doing and building the bridges. So like a lot of times, you know, I have talked to friends that are not yet in the intuitive community and try to explain it to them. And as I often joke with Megan Elizabeth, it's like, I don't know, I've been here 4 years and I'm still trying to figure out how to more concisely and clearly say what it's about, because it's about a lot of things. But what I can say, it's been really, really impactful in my life personally and professionally, and it's worth leaning in and getting to know. And I'm sure the same could be said of Peter Block's work, which now I'm going to look up some of those books that you all referenced, and Rob, your work, and like all the different layers, but it's all for community empowerment. It's all for mutual aid and mutual support, and to really change the world. And, you know, that's another reason I like the intuitive community, is like, it's another world. That's like, we're sort of building the boat as we sail it, right? And so there's another world that I'm immersed in every day, with the hierarchies and the power structures and the hegemony of like the medical model, MDs being the top dogs and everybody else trickling down from there. And then I go to the intuitive community. It's like, wow, here's people who, you know, on paper are not getting paid, or not maybe having all the degrees and initials after their name, but way wiser and with way more integrity and more insight into what is needed and how to build it. So how can we just keep building that boat as we're sailing it, right? And how can we support each other in doing that? And how can we get more people involved? Because we need it. It shouldn't be that the peer centers, the respite care centers, the IDHA type places or Wildflower are so few and far between. Those should be all over the place. So we're pollinating and we're, you know, kind of brainstorming together. And in the meantime, we are, I guess, affirming each other's place in the system of change that we're all in.
A couple of big riffs there. I'm loving hearing that. I want to offer an invitation, kind of to go through. And Rob, I would love to hear where you start with this. What I was wondering when I was hearing that, first thing when you were talking about that this mode of treatment and treatment by experts, and this idea that we need to purchase the care that is required, and I'm wondering, what might the world that we know of look like where wellness was not about treatment and care? That what is a world, a caring and thriving world, look like without expert treatment? I'm wondering if that's the reason I say that is you talked 50 years ago. I just discovered Ivan Illich, right? This whole deschooling society and kind of what is it like to move back into the convivial world, that's where people are together. And he's very much about this expert treatment. It is not just medicalization. It's about the education system, is all these other systems. So I'm wondering if there's a vision in your mind, a possibility of a world where there is thriving without treatment.
Well, I that's a tough question, but you know, I would say that I think part of where your question's coming from, we would probably agree that wellness, mental health,
Wellness.
these terms have become very problematic. You know, in a way, I don't even want to say I'm shooting for a well society, you know, or for a society where wellness, because those terms have become so intertwined now with I've got a notion of what wellness is and I impose it upon another, or, you know, things like that. One of the things I think about is, even just when I was growing up, this idea wasn't nearly so permeating. Like it was widely recognized that, hey, you know what? Artists have as much to say about how to live a life as any sort of quote unquote mental health professional has, maybe even more. And so the notion of, you know, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, you know, that was something I read as in my teens, you know, and that was like, I don't know how many 100 years older than that book, but the notion of Dostoevsky is one of my favorite writers that I grew up with, where a lot of his stories are about very, very troubled main characters in particular, and I found them engaging and endearing and exciting, and loved the way they lived their lives, you know. And it's as troubled as they were also very inspiring and gave me ideas. So I think that's important, that somehow some of the vitality and what I would call the wellness of life has nothing to do with the kind of notion as it's presented now in the mainstream and by the United Nations definition of mental health or whatever, like those things. So I don't, you know, in a way, don't even go down that pathway. I think a lot of the things we've been talking about are part of that. And honestly, I'm not much of a person for going down the utopian vision. So I might turn the question back to you, but I want to respond
Sure.
to one of the things that Kim was talking about, which I think is so important. And it's really, I wanted to just address that's not happening and why that's not happening, which is that I hear from lots of people who are current or former practitioners who worked in the system who are equally, if not more critical of the system itself. And they're acutely aware of what's going on because they're inside it and they see it. And as soon as they start applying a somewhat critical lens, they have a view into it that is, you know, incredibly effective. And so, but they're often not speaking out. Some are, clearly, and I salute them, but a lot aren't because they feel that they can't, because they feel that they too are subject to the kinds of threats and coercive nature of this system that is in place. And as one nurse said to me for my book, he said, a mental health nurse said, I believe that the liberation of mental health nurses is entirely intertwined with the liberation of the psychiatric patients as well. And he affirmed that I don't want to suggest that they're the same, that somehow we're as oppressed as they are, but I do think that they're never going to get free unless we can get free too. And that, because he said, I want the right to conscientious objection. There are lots of circumstances at work where I don't believe this person needs to be strapped down and forcibly injected right now, but some other colleagues of mine do. And I want the right to just full on say, no, I'm not going to participate in this because I don't believe in it. And currently that right does not exist in law. And so people like that often also feel under threat and under coercion in the system. And that's one of the reasons that we're not even getting to level one, let alone our visionary ideas about change. We're not even getting to the level where, hey, every practitioner feels perfectly comfortable saying what they feel and hearing from others about what they feel, dialoguing it out together and making a new decision based on what they've heard. No, they feel under threat in their environment. And that's something we really got to change. We got to create an environment where all practitioners feel comfortable and able to speak up and as honestly as they may want to.
Oof, boy, this brings to me a vision of the movie 12 Angry Men. That there was one, the Henry Fonda character in the room. He was the one who stood up from the very beginning for the innocence of the young man who was accused of a crime. And that then the justice system held, because he held out to make sure that that person's voice was truly understood. And that I don't know, but I'm not sure. And he stood with that whole the jury process of this kid who was accused of murder, who was innocent. But to me, what struck me was that system of justice that we have for people who have violated the laws of the land, that those ways of treating, there's a Miranda law, right? So that you have to read someone their rights before you incarcerate them. And they have the rights to one phone call and all these kinds of structures that have been set up from the justice system that to me sounds like they are completely absent from the system of providing to ensuring the health, whatever we want to call it, health, wellness, thriving, joy, of people who have who are isolated on the other side of things. So that's this idea of there's an unjustness or this injustice being done to folks that it would be, boy, wouldn't it be nice if there were a jury of peers before someone was incarcerated in that way. And I think
a jury of actual peers.
Of actual peers.
Actual peers.
Actual peers. Yeah. So please, Joha, you wanted to go, and then Megan Elizabeth, I know you're there too.
I was just going to add to what Rob was saying, and it's like if they could consciously object, if they could dialogue, also if they could safely document, right, based on our conversation last time, right, that it's safe to put that on the books, and then we have data, we have something to refer back to, which is such a big issue. I'm constantly getting vague interpretations of policy as a barrier to something, and I try to get them to write it down, and they throw up some excuse, and we talked about that last time quite a lot.
Yeah, and one of the things, just following up on what Brian, you were just saying, is just thought it's a simple shift would be take away all authorities ultimately invested in the medical professional and create an interdisciplinary team that makes a decision about whether or not to involuntarily commit a person, whether or not they need treatment, what kind of treatment, allow the person, of course, themselves to participate on that team. But I think that alone, such a simple change, right? But that alone would, I think, radically alter how all of these circumstances are playing out.
Yeah, and just to riff on that and kind of generally weave these things together, as our colleague Brendan is often saying, like, this, and we do too, the solutions for this stuff exist, and there's pilot projects. So again, just like bridging and public media and conversations and information sharing, and if you have the privilege and time and bandwidth to study and educate yourself about these things, or get involved. I know that a lot of my peers, or peers with slightly less affect than I have, they're very busy and they don't prioritize like studying or getting involved in things. And so, like citizen engagement is part of why our democracy isn't working very well, for example. So just weaving some of that in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why I think we're all fans of asset-based community development and reconnecting communities, because that's rebuilding grassroots democracy as well at the same time. And we're desperately short of that. And in part, we have to blame our governments for having created it over decades of time, where they've made it, all of our governments, it seems, have been tended to be increasingly authoritarian in their approaches, where they didn't want freedom of information laws to be very functional. They didn't want a lot of active participation. And now there's a frustration out there across the board politically, which is manifesting in violence. Like I abhor that kind of violence, but I kind of understand it, because people are so frustrated with the lack of responsiveness of their governments over a period of time, and they just feel like they have no voice. And so this is the way they're going to express it now. And so, yeah, we got to rebuild that connection too, from grassroots democracy, and reconnecting, making sure that we're getting people voted into power who are going to listen and be responsive to their constituents, to communities, because right now they're very disconnected that way, and it's creating increased problems.
There are so many more conversation points. This is just a really wonderful basis for our continuing work. The 2 hours we got to spend 2 weeks ago, Rob, and getting to do this with you today is really nutritive for the process of so many different groups. So the network is worldwide. There are a much larger number of people involved than I can count, because I have left hemisphere neurological damage. And the impact that it has on group members who are often having to work privately, who often cannot participate at all in the conversations in public media. And they usually can't join larger groups either. They're working in lots and lots of very little groups, where they feel a sense of stability and trust when their lives are chaos. For them to be connected to our conversations here, because we're all working with the same set of platforms. We all share a desire for voices that have been really squashed to get to be uplifted together, for more people to have pathways to share what they know and be heard, and participate fully in a community dynamic, in the community body. So many of your points in your book, your consent is not required. So many of the pieces of information that you've been publishing on Substack and on YouTube in such great ways, they fuel this really powerfully. And so much of it just isn't visible. We don't have a way to make much more of it visible, except by like another little increment and another little increment. So we're continuing to move that forward, and I'm so grateful for the ways that you've put your work out into the world. because it's been hugely impactful already, and those impacts are continuing.
Thank you all. It's awesome. Thank you for doing the work you're doing to bring up those voices as well. And yeah, it's just a pleasure talking with everybody today.
We did. Look what we did.
Look what we did. We done did it. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
I want to encourage everyone to find Rob at robwipond.substack.com and at robwipond.com. We're putting those along the bottom of the screen. There are also more links on the Intuitive Public Radio Network Substack, which you can find by typing Intuitive Public Radio. You can find Rob's Substack by typing in Psych Force Report into Substack. You can find that there. It's full of really, really excellent stuff, really exceptional journalism.
Yeah. And I think Rob wrote a book. You know, the book is called something or other, I think, maybe.
I want to put that at the, well, we've said it a few times.
Yes, I your consent is not required.
Right here.
There you
Happen
go.
to have a copy.
Just, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. You would.
Your consent is not required. Yes, available also in audiobook, a great reader of it in audiobook format, and EPUB and Kindle as well, I think, wherever books are sold. So thank you for support if you can afford to buy a book.
And I want to mention too, because there's a lot of challenging stuff for people who have been through violence, for people who have been through forced incarceration. It can be hard to read about. Anybody who wants to read Rob's book, but be with others in it, come and find us in the Intuitive Network. Comment, reach out to me. Find us. If you can read the book more easily, if there are people there talking with you about it, we are here for that. That's part of why we are here, is to help people absorb more of that material, because it's such important stuff and it's life-saving.
A lot of people have said that for you. It goes one way or the other. You people feel like incredibly excited because, wow, my experiences are being voiced here and things like that. Or they're like, oh, every page too much reminding me of my own experiences, and they can't read it. And by the way, I want to say, I mean, I've always thought it'd be awesome to actually participate in a group read too, where maybe everybody reads a chapter a bit, and then I get to participate in the discussion that happens afterward. I'd love to do that if you want to ever get a group of people together to.
That is a great idea. Thank you for suggesting that. I'm gonna look into it. I think that's excellent.
I'll host that one for sure. I'm happy to do it. All right, I think this delicious gravy train. I think we are reaching the end, or this is not the end, folks. I'm gonna come off video here in Zoom. I'll let you all continue to be together, and I'll be back in a moment. So say goodbye. Say goodnight, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everybody.
So this is the part.
This is the part how Ryan comes in and just says, Megan Elizabeth's talking to me in the background. Bye, everybody. We'll see y'all later.